Pacific Rim Uprising. This is, of course, the sequel to the 2013 film Pacific Rim, which came out 5 years ago. Damn, that was so long ago. And, of course, this film takes place 10 years after the events of the first movie, and basically, some weird shit is happening with the suits, and basically, and more kaiju are coming up, and yeah, and they're gonna go fight the monsters and stuff. Now, unlike most people, I didn't love Pacific Rim. I thought it was an okay film, but I found it to be pretty shallow for the most part. I mean, some of the monster fights were sometimes cool, and I'll get to that here in a little bit. But however, the main problem of the movie for me, one of the main problems for the movie for me, was that, trying to add character itself isn't a bad idea. I mean, I don't mind if you're trying to add character in there, but the characterization just wasn't really that impactful. It was just, Now, some movies like Dunkirk or Rogue One, like, clearly their motive is set in the real. I mean, not set in the real. Like, basically, it's set with, like, the main point of the movie is the story and the world that surrounds the characters. You get a little bit of character, you get a little bit of character, but the movie doesn't really rely on the actual characters trying to drive the movie. It's the story and the world that drives the story. But with Pacific Rim, they tried to focus on the characters, and while that usually wouldn't be a bad thing, they weren't really able to do it that well in the first film. And like I said, some of the action scenes in the first movie were cool, but the best way I can describe it was that, again, like the characterization, the fights eventually became hollow, because there's not really much you can do with giant robots and giant monsters that tower above the skyscrapers. Something like Transformers. I mean, I know everyone shits on the Transformers movies, and I've only seen the first two, but I'm going to be mainly talking about the first Transformers, the one that most people can agree is either the best one or the least worst one. I do actually really like that first Transformers movie. But while there were giant robots in Transformers, they weren't, ridiculously huge, so that way they could still interact with our world. But with Pacific Rim, when the monsters and the robots are taller than skyscrapers, then really you can't have a lot of variety in the action, because it's basically the same setting all over the place, just buildings and buildings and buildings and more buildings. And it didn't help that the last part of the movie where there's like some sort of underwater thing going on, like, that wasn't, that's where the action got really boring for me. But I like the first Pacific Rim. It's fine, it's okay. So I wasn't really looking that forward to Pacific Rim Uprising, and I guess it hasn't been getting that many great critical reviews either. But I'll probably say it's better than the first one, I guess. I mean, again, that's not really saying a whole lot, because I don't hold Pacific Rim to that, higher up standard. But really, my main issues and my main things I can praise about this movie are mostly the things that were exactly like in the first movie. I mean, the characterization, the characters weren't really that interesting, and a lot of the times there'd be sometimes there'd be some pretty boring action where it's just two giant things, fighting each other, and it's just like slow-mo fighting and whatnot. And that's actually another that's actually another advantage that the Transformers movies had over, or at least the first Transformers. Again, I've only seen 1 and 2, but with Transformers, like I said, they weren't ridiculously big, and because they were big but not stupid big, they were able to move really quickly, because when you see some of those shots in the first Transformers, like this really awesome highway chase scene where this one Transformer is just like driving alongside this highway and just smashes into a bus, and like that stuff is quick. And again, like with the end battle of Transformers, a lot of the action does feel big, but it also feels quick. With Pacific Rim, the action was always like I guess that's how it would sort of work out, but I don't like watching slow fight scenes or slow action. I like action that's quick and that where you can still feel the weight of everything, but you know, just having it be basically a slow-mo shot, like a bunch of slow-mo shots, even though it's technically not slow-mo shots, it gets a little boring after a while. And so sometimes we get that in Pacific Rim Uprising. I will say John Boyega is pretty good in this movie. Like I said, his character along with the other characters aren't really that interesting, but I can tell he is giving a pretty good performance out of it. I don't think it's as good as his performance as Finn from the new Star Wars movies, but I mean, he does do a pretty good job in this movie as well. And you know, I don't really remember a lot of the characters. There's this one character played by Scott Eastwood. I don't really remember a lot about him. However, there's one character in this movie who, when I first saw him in the movie, I was like, oh my god, they got him in this movie. And that's Karan Barar. Now, in case you don't know who Karan Barar is, he's from this Disney Channel show called Bunked. Bunked is awful. It's an awful show, and he was awful in it. Thankfully, though, he's okay in this. Because in Bunked, they had him do a really, really bad Indian accent, and it was not convincing at all. It sounded so terrible. Thankfully, they didn't do that they didn't do that in Pacific Rim Uprising. They had him use his real voice, and it sounds so much more natural than trying to do a forced Indian accent that really doesn't sound that good. So, yeah, that's one thing I can say about this movie, is that at least Karan Barar, at least I can say, has the potential to be a good actor. But, however, another one of my problems is that sometimes the CGI just didn't look all that great sometimes. I will say in the first Pacific Rim, while I kind of disagree with people when they say that Pacific Rim should have been nominated for an Oscar for visual effects. Like, no, I can think of a few more movies that I would have chosen for best visual effects over Pacific Rim. Hell, Man of Steel didn't even make the short list. I'm still shocked at that. But the effects, like some of the effects were actually pretty good, especially when you see this really big monster at the end. That looked really cool. But for the most part, they weren't awful. Like, they weren't awful effects. But at times they didn't really feel like big robots. So there's that. Now, in all this, I'm trying to think here. Now, like I said, I do think this is just a tad bit better than the first one, because even though the characters weren't that interesting, they were a little bit more interesting in this movie. And another thing that I will say this movie did improve on than the predecessor was that even though there were a few fight scenes that were just like and were just slow and boring to watch, around the third act, the action picks up. Like there are lots of parts where robots and monsters are just going, I mean, of course they're not going, lightning fast or whatever, but they're moving at decent speed, and that's at least a little bit more interesting to watch than just a complete slow-mo fest. And there actually even is one robot that is basically Transformers size, where it's big, to where you can feel the weight and scope of this robot, but however it's also small enough to interact with the environment of the city so that you can get more variations and more variety with the action, instead of just building after building after building after building. Because eventually I feel like they can just get boring after a while when you just have these two huge things that are way bigger than buildings just fighting each other. That's That's how. That's also one of the reasons why I really enjoy like some of the other monster movies nowadays, like the 2014 Godzilla and King Kong, because like even though with Godzilla the action was pretty slow, they didn't like it wasn't like a complete it was like one of the reasons why I loved that was that it wasn't like it was actually ironically something that most people had a problem with in the first Godzilla, which was there wasn't a whole lot of it. Because when you don't have a lot of it and you save all of that stuff for the end, at least for me anyways, it like that rouses my interest a lot more because it's mostly just a film that has build up and tension so that when the payoff finally comes, it feels all that more special. With Pacific Rim, the first one, and sometimes to an extent of Pacific Rim Uprising, but like I said, the third act with the action catches up a lot better. It was mainly just fight after fight after fight after fight, and it would get boring after a while. And because of the fact that it was fight after fight after fight, along with the really slow mo fighting style, like the action just wasn't engaging. And another example of really cool monster fights that I think were really interesting were were the ones in Kong Skull Island that I just mentioned earlier. With Kong Skull Island and Godzilla, actually, those pique my interest a lot more because even though they still have creatures that are the size of skyscrapers and whatnot, and as we saw in Kong Skull Island, we learned that Kong is only going to get bigger because if you don't know, they're going to cross that over with Godzilla in 2020 for Godzilla vs. Kong. I'm really excited for that. But another advantage that those movies had over Pacific Rim and Pacific Rim Uprising were that it felt like real creatures duking it out. They weren't trying to have this really big, overblown spectacle. Because whenever you see these creatures fight, it would make sense. Like, you would expect Kong to like grab this one chain thing that with a motorboat thing at the end, or an anchor or whatnot. Because I'm pretty sure an ape would be smart enough to do that, to use tools to fight and whatnot. And like I said with Kong, and in fact in Kong Skull Island, the action was pretty quick. Like whenever King Kong was smashing through helicopters or smashing through an octopus creature or lizard creatures, it was very quick and energetic. And yeah, this has really become more of a talk about different movie monster fights or robot fights in movies. But whatever the case, like in the end, I do like Pacific. I thought Pacific Rim Uprising was okay. It was a little bit better than the first one, but like I said, I don't really hold the first Pacific Rim up to that high standard of science fiction monster movies as a lot of other people would. So I'm going to give Pacific Rim Uprising a 6 out of 10. I don't think it's as bad as people are making out to be, but like I said, just right beforehand, I don't really think Pacific Rim, the first one, was ever all that great anyway. I liked it. I liked it fine. I liked this one fine. It's just, I'm just going to be looking more forward to Godzilla 2 next year and Godzilla vs. Kong. Hell yeah! In any case, what do you think of Pacific Rim Uprising? Have you seen Pacific Rim Uprising? Let me know down in the comments below what you think. Thank you so much for watching. Give this video a like. Share the video so we can get the channel circulated. And if you want to see more, click this.